There is a photograph taken sometime in 1938 of a group of SS officers standing in a courtyard at Buchenwald. They are smiling. Behind them, barely visible in the frame, a wooden post rises from the ground with iron hooks bolted near its top. The post looks unremarkable, the kind of thing you might use to hang a lantern. It was, in fact, used to hang human beings by their dislocated arms until they screamed themselves unconscious. The officers knew what the post was for. They were smiling anyway. This was not an anomaly. Across the camp system, photographs recovered after the war show SS personnel posing cheerfully beside instruments of torture, gathering for Christmas celebrations within earshot of the dying, and hosting family picnics on the grounds of facilities designed for mass murder. In one particularly chilling set of images, the so-called Höcker Album, discovered in 2007 and now held at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, SS officers and female auxiliaries at Auschwitz are seen laughing, eating blueberries, and singing accordion songs at a retreat lodge in Solahütte, just 30 kilometers from the gas chambers. The album is dated to the summer of 1944, the precise period during which the Hungarian Jewish transports were arriving at Birkenau at a rate of over 10,000 people per day. As the historian Mary Fulbrook observed in her study of ordinary perpetrators, the most disturbing thing about these photographs is not the evidence of evil, it is the evidence of enjoyment. That culture of casual, almost recreational cruelty captures something essential about torture in the Nazi concentration camp system. It was not hidden in shame. It was practiced openly, regulated bureaucratically, and in many cases, savored as entertainment. Unlike the torture chambers of medieval inquisitions or modern intelligence black sites, where pain serves as a crude tool for extracting confessions or information, the tortures of the lager existed for a fundamentally different purpose. They were instruments of erasure. The goal was not to make a prisoner talk, but to make them stop being a person, to reduce a thinking, feeling, hoping human being into what camp inmates themselves came to call a Musulman, a term of uncertain origin used to describe prisoners who had crossed an invisible threshold beyond hunger, beyond exhaustion, beyond fear, into a state of utter psychological annihilation. The Musulmans still walked, they still breathed, but the person inside was already gone. The Italian chemist and Auschwitz survivor Primo Levi described them as an anonymous mass, continually renewed and always identical, of non-men who march and labor in silence, the divine spark dead within them. The Austrian philosopher Jean Améry, who was himself subjected to the strappado at the Gestapo prison of Braindonk in Belgium before being deported to Auschwitz, wrote in his 1966 essay, At the Mind's Limits, that the first blow from a torturer permanently destroys something he called trust in the world. The basic, unspoken assumption that other human beings will respect the boundaries of your body. Whoever has succumbed to torture, Améry wrote, can no longer feel at home in the world. The shame of destruction cannot be erased. Améry survived the camps, but died by his own hand in 1978, one of countless survivors for whom liberation did not mean the end of suffering. Viktor Frankl, the Viennese psychiatrist who endured 3 years across 4 camps, including Auschwitz, articulated the process differently in Man's Search for Meaning. He described a 3-stage psychological journey: shock upon arrival, apathy as a survival mechanism, and finally a kind of emotional death in which the prisoner looked on and could no longer feel disgusted. The entire architecture of camp torture, its instruments, its rituals, its carefully maintained randomness, was designed to manufacture this extinction of the self on an industrial scale. What made the Nazi camp system particularly grotesque was its insistence on formality. Torture was not merely tolerated, it was codified. The Lagerordnung, the official camp regulations developed initially at Dachau under Theodor Eicke in 1933 and later exported to virtually every camp in the system, included specific punishments for specific infractions. Eicke, a former police informer and psychiatric patient whom Heinrich Himmler personally appointed as commandant of Dachau, was the architect of this system. His disciplinary and punishment regulations for the prison camp, issued on October 1, 1933, established a blueprint that would be replicated across the entire camp network. Smoking in the barracks could earn a beating. Failing to make a bed with geometric precision could earn a flogging. Being too slow during roll call, possessing an unauthorized object, addressing an SS officer without removing one's cap, or removing one's cap too slowly. Each had its prescribed dose of violence. Ike's regulations even specified that any prisoner who makes derogatory or sarcastic remarks to a member of the SS would be hanged, while anyone who engages in politics, gives inciting speeches, holds meetings, or forms cliques would be hanged as an agitator under the terms of the revolutionary law. The language was legalistic, bureaucratic, almost corporate in its tone, and that was entirely deliberate. This bureaucratization of pain served a dual function. It gave individual sadism the cover of institutional authority, and it created an environment where prisoners understood that cruelty was not an aberration, but the system itself. As Eugen Kogon, a political prisoner who survived 7 years at Buchenwald and later wrote The Theory and Practice of Hell, one of the earliest and most comprehensive accounts of the camp system, published in 1946, noted, "The regulations were not designed to maintain order. They were designed to make every prisoner a perpetual offender." Among the most feared of these official punishments was the Pfahlhängen, known in English as the strappado or tree hanging. The method was devastatingly simple. A prisoner's wrists were bound together behind their back, not in front, behind, so that the arms were already twisted into an unnatural position. A rope was then attached to the wrists and threaded through a hook mounted high on a post or tree. The prisoner was hoisted off the ground by that rope, so that the full weight of their body hung from arms wrenched backward. The shoulder joints dislocated almost immediately, often with an audible sound that survivors described as something they could never forget. At Buchenwald, Kogon documented cases in which men were left hanging for hours, sometimes with heavy stones tied to their feet to increase the downward pull. He recorded the testimony of a prisoner who described the moment of dislocation as a white explosion behind my eyes, and then a pain so complete that it became the whole world. There was no thought left, no memory, no self, only the pain. Victims were suspended like this for periods ranging from 1 hour to an entire afternoon. Those who lost consciousness were sometimes revived with cold water, so the punishment could continue. At Dachau, the Protestant pastor Martin Niemöller, famous today for his post-war confession beginning, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out," was imprisoned as Hitler's personal prisoner from 1938 to 1945, and witnessed the strappado being applied regularly in the camp's punishment yard, the bunker. Niemöller's account, combined with Kogon's and those of hundreds of other witnesses at the post-war Dachau and Nuremberg trials, established the strappado as one of the defining horrors of the camp system. The practice was not an SS invention. It dates back to the strappata of Renaissance Italian judicial torture and was employed by the Spanish Inquisition. But its systematic application across dozens of camps, from Dachau to Sachsenhausen to Ravensbrück to Neuengamme, reflected the regime's talent for industrializing even the most ancient forms of cruelty. Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz who was tried and hanged in 1947, admitted in his autobiography written while awaiting execution that he had personally witnessed the strappado on numerous occasions and considered it an established part of camp routine. If the strappado was medieval in its origins, the device known as the Boga Schaukel, the Boga swing, was a distinctly 20th century innovation and one that belonged to a single man. Its creator, SS Oberscharführer Wilhelm Boga, served in the political department, Politische Abteilung, at Auschwitz, essentially the camp's Gestapo office, where he was responsible for interrogations of prisoners suspected of resistance activity, escape planning, or smuggling. Boga was known among inmates by a nickname that conveyed both terror and grim irony, the Tiger of Auschwitz. He designed his apparatus with the methodical care of an engineer solving a technical problem, how to inflict maximum pain on a human body while keeping the victim completely immobilized. The device consisted of a heavy iron bar mounted horizontally between two supports. The prisoner was forced to squat, and their wrists were shackled or tied to their ankles. The bar was then slid through the gap between the bent knees and the crooked elbows, so that the victim hung from it like a trussed animal, curled into a fetal position, utterly helpless, rotating slowly. In this position, the buttocks and soles of the feet, some of the most nerve-dense areas of the body, were fully exposed and taut. Boger and his assistants then beat the suspended prisoner with rods, whips, and wooden clubs, concentrating their blows on these sensitive areas, sometimes for hours. Former prisoner Hermann Langbein, who served as a clerk in the camp and later became one of the key organizers of the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, documented in his book People in Auschwitz that Boger often smoked cigarettes and made casual conversation with other SS men while administering beatings on the swing, pausing between strikes to take a drag or tell a joke. It was this banality, the ordinariness of the torturer's demeanor, that survivors found most disorienting. One witness, a former prisoner named Dunja Wasserstrom, described the screams produced by the device as not human. They were the sounds of an animal that does not exist. Another survivor, the Polish political prisoner Jan Pilecki, not to be confused with Witold Pilecki, the famous volunteer infiltrator of Auschwitz, testified that he saw a young woman die on the swing after Boger ruptured her internal organs, and that Boger's only reaction was irritation that the interrogation had been cut short. At the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, which ran from December 1963 to August 1965, then the largest criminal trial in West German history, with over 350 witnesses and 20 defendants, Boger was confronted with testimony after testimony about his swing. He did not deny the device's existence, but attempted to characterize it as a standard interrogation method. The presiding judge, Hans Hofmeier, was unconvinced. Boger was convicted of murder and accessory to murder in at least 114 cases and sentenced to life imprisonment, plus an additional 15 years. He died in prison in 1977, having never expressed remorse. The Frankfurt trial itself was a watershed moment in German public consciousness. For the first time, ordinary Germans who had spent 2 decades avoiding the details of what had happened in the camps were confronted with those details in a public courtroom, delivered in the voices of those who had survived them. The third pillar of the standardized physical torture system was the Prügelbock, the flogging bench. This was a wooden frame, sometimes padded with leather, shaped roughly like a sawhorse, over which a prisoner was bent at the waist so that their lower body was exposed and restrained. The prescribed punishment was 25 strokes delivered with a cane, a bullwhip, or a rubber truncheon, the number 25 itself a legacy of Prussian military punishment codes. But the punishment carried a psychological refinement that elevated it beyond mere beating. The victim was required to count each stroke aloud, in German. For the millions of non-German-speaking prisoners, Poles, Russians, French, Greeks, Hungarians, Italians, Norwegians, this meant counting in a foreign language while enduring searing pain. If a prisoner lost count, mispronounced a number, screamed instead of counting, or lost consciousness, the count reset to 1. The punishment thus became a perverse test of linguistic performance under duress, a game rigged to ensure that 25 strokes could easily become 50, 75, or more. The regulations technically required the presence of a camp physician during flogging, ostensibly to prevent fatalities, but in practice, doctors either turned a blind eye or actively participated. At Dachau, where the Prügelbock was used extensively, SS physician Dr. Fritz Hintermeyer was documented as being present during floggings and declaring prisoners fit to continue when they clearly were not. Medical records from the camp show that kidney failure, ruptured blood vessels, and permanent spinal damage were common consequences. At Auschwitz, the Prügelbock was set up in the roll call square, the Appellplatz, so that the entire assembled camp population of thousands was forced to witness the punishment, transforming each session into a public spectacle of power. Rudolf Höss noted in his memoirs that Himmler himself had approved the formal regulations for the Prügelbock and required that a written report on each flogging be submitted to the Inspectorate of Concentration Camps in Berlin. Yet another example of the meticulous bureaucratic documentation of torture that later served as crucial evidence at Nuremberg. Many prisoners did not survive the bench. Those who did carried the scars, both physical and psychological, for life. Not all torture in the camps involved a specific device or a designated session. Some of the most effective methods of destroying human beings required no tools at all, only time, space, and the deliberate manipulation of physical conditions. In many ways, these environmental tortures were more insidious than the formalized punishments because they were woven into the fabric of daily life, inescapable and relentless. In the basement of Block 11 at Auschwitz, the so-called Death Block, a squat brick building whose windows were permanently sealed with wooden shutters and whose entrance was flanked by a high concrete wall where thousands of prisoners were executed by firing squad. There existed a row of cells that measured approximately 90 centimeters by 90 centimeters. These were the Stateszellen, the standing cells. They were exactly what the name implied, enclosures so small that a person could not sit, kneel, crouch, or turn around. They could only stand. The cells were constructed of brick, with a small opening near the floor, approximately 50 centimeters square, that served as the only entrance. Prisoners had to crawl in on their hands and knees through this hatch, which was then sealed. Up to 4 human beings were forced into a single cell, pressed against one another in total darkness, breathing each other's increasingly oxygen-depleted breath, unable to move, unable to relieve themselves except where they stood, for the entire night. In the morning, they were pulled out and sent to perform a full day of forced labor in the camp's workshops or agricultural details. At night, they were returned to the cell. This cycle could continue for days, weeks, or, in documented cases, over a month. The standing cells were located near the starvation and thirst bunkers, so prisoners in the Stateszellen could often hear the moans and ravings of those dying of hunger and dehydration in adjacent chambers, a layering of horrors that compounded the psychological torment. Former Auschwitz prisoner Kazimierz Piechowski, who in 1942 pulled off one of the most daring escapes in the camp's history by stealing SS uniforms and driving out the main gate in a commandeered car, described the standing cells as being worse than any beating, because the beating ends, but the cell never ends. It is always the same, always dark, always pressing against you. Witold Pilecki, the Polish resistance officer who in 1940 deliberately had himself arrested and sent to Auschwitz to gather intelligence, arguably one of the most extraordinary acts of voluntary self-sacrifice in the history of espionage, wrote in his 1945 report to the Polish government in exile that the standing cells of Block 11 were among the most feared punishments in the camp, and that prisoners subjected to them for more than 2 weeks often emerged unable to stand on their own, their legs having atrophied into uselessness. The concrete wall adjacent to Block 11, known simply as the Black Wall or the Death Wall, where an estimated several thousand prisoners were made to remove their clothing and executed. Prisoners in the standing cells could sometimes hear the gunfire through the bricks. Outside the cells, the open spaces of the camp offered their own forms of torment. SS guards frequently ordered what they sardonically called sport, punitive physical drills imposed on prisoners who were already on the edge of starvation and collapse. After a 12-hour shift in a quarry or a factory, inmates would be forced to run through knee-deep mud, to perform hundreds of squats, to execute frog jumps across the parade ground until their legs gave out, or to roll back and forth in snow or gravel until their skin was shredded raw. The guards treated it as entertainment, often placing bets on which prisoners would collapse first. At Mauthausen, one of the most brutal camps in the system, perched on a granite hilltop above the Danube in Upper Austria, sport was often imposed on newly arrived prisoners as a form of initiation, a way of communicating within their first hours that their bodies no longer belonged to them. Mauthausen had its own unique geography of torture. The camp sat above a granite quarry connected by 186 steep, uneven stone steps known to prisoners as the Todesstiege, the stairs of death. Prisoners in the quarry detail were forced to carry granite blocks weighing up to 50 kilograms up these stairs at a running pace, with SS guards beating anyone who slowed down. Those who stumbled and fell often knocked down the prisoners behind them, creating cascading human avalanches that could kill dozens at once. In a practice that survivors called the parachutists, guards sometimes forced prisoners at the top of the quarry cliff to choose between pushing the man in front of them off the edge or being pushed off themselves. Another instance of the system's genius for forced complicity. Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter who was imprisoned at Mauthausen in the final months of the war, later wrote that the quarry was not a workplace. It was a machine for turning human beings into corpses, one step at a time. The ultimate purpose of sport and labor torture alike was death by exhaustion, a method that left no bullet holes, no ligature marks, no evidence of anything other than a body that had simply stopped functioning. On camp records, these deaths were listed as natural causes: heart failure, pneumonia, general physical decline, and the fiction was maintained with clerical precision. Water and cold were weaponized with equal deliberateness, blurring the line between torture and murder. At Mauthausen, prisoners were forced to stand outdoors in winter conditions, at times without clothing, while guards repeatedly doused them with ice water, waiting for the onset of hypothermia with the patience of men who had all the time in the world. The practice was documented by multiple survivors and corroborated during the Mauthausen trial at Dachau in 1946, one of the largest war crimes proceedings conducted by the United States military, in which 61 former camp personnel were convicted and 58 sentenced to death. Similar practices were documented in the Soviet Gulag system, particularly in the camps of Kolyma in northeastern Siberia. What Varlam Shalamov, who spent 17 years there and later wrote the devastating Kolyma tales, called "The Pole of Cold and Cruelty in This Land." In Kolyma, where the winter temperature routinely dropped below -50 degrees Celsius, prisoners working in the gold mines were sometimes punished by being tied to trees and left exposed overnight. At those temperatures, death came within hours. Shalamov wrote that in Kolyma, everything human that had been grafted on through millennia of education and civilization, all that fell away in a very short time, a matter of weeks. The parallel between the Nazi and Soviet systems is instructive. Though ideologically opposed, both arrived independently at the same conclusion: that cold was free, abundant, and lethal, and that the natural environment could be conscripted as an accomplice in mass murder. At Dachau, this convergence found its most scientifically grotesque expression in the freezing experiments conducted by Dr. Sigmund Rasche under Himmler's personal sponsorship between 1942 and 1943. Rasche submerged prisoners in tanks of ice water for up to 3 hours, meticulously recording their core body temperatures as they dropped, the point at which they lost consciousness, and the exact moment of death. Data that was intended to help the Luftwaffe develop protocols for rescuing German pilots downed in the North Sea. Between 80 and 100 prisoners died in these experiments. Himmler, reviewing Rasche's reports, wrote in October 1942 that the experiments should examine animal warmth, the practice of having a woman lie beside a hypothermic subject, as a possible rewarming technique. The proposal was carried out. The experiments produced no scientifically valid rewarming data, but they produced meticulous records of how long it takes a human being to freeze to death. Beyond the standardized and environmental methods, individual camps and individual officers developed their own localized tortures, innovations born not from policy directives, but from personal sadism and the absolute impunity that the camp system granted its staff. The sociologist Wolfgang Sofsky, in his landmark 1993 study, The Order of Terror, the Concentration Camp, argued that the camp created what he called absolute power, a condition in which the captor's authority over the captive was so total that conventional moral restraints simply dissolved and cruelty became a form of self-expression. It is in this context that the most bizarre, most intimate, and often most psychologically devastating tortures emerged. One of the more insidious practices was what survivors called the singing torture. Prisoners, sometimes during roll call, sometimes during beatings, sometimes while being forced to watch the execution of their fellow inmates, were ordered to sing. Not dirges, not laments. They were ordered to sing cheerful songs, folk tunes, children's songs, patriotic anthems, drinking songs. The dissonance was the point. a prisoner standing in mud, watching a friend strangled to death on a gallows, forced to sing a Bavarian drinking song at the top of their lungs. This was not punishment in any conventional sense. It was a deliberate assault on the coherence of inner life, a way of making the victim complicit in the mockery of their own suffering. The practice existed on a continuum with the broader weaponization of music in the camps. At Auschwitz, an inmate orchestra was forced to play lively marches at the main gate every morning and evening as work details filed in and out, tens of thousands of starving, broken people marching in step to Strauss waltzes and military quicksteps. The women's orchestra at Birkenau was led for a time by Alma Rosé, the niece of the composer Gustav Mahler, a virtuoso violinist who had performed on the stages of Vienna before the war, and now conducted an ensemble of half-starved women playing for the amusement of their captors and the psychological torment of their fellow prisoners. Rosé died under mysterious circumstances in Birkenau in April 1944. Possibly poisoned, possibly from food poisoning, the cause was never conclusively established. Survivors of the orchestra described a unique agony. The music kept them alive, because musicians were spared the worst labor details, but it also made them instruments of the very system that was destroying their people. Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, a cellist in the Birkenau Orchestra who survived and later became a founding member of the English Chamber Orchestra, said in a 2018 interview, "We played, and the people walked to the gas chambers, and the music made it all seem orderly, even civilized. That was the worst thing. The music made it look like it was normal." Survivors described the singing torture as among the hardest things to endure, because it attacked not the body, but the sense that one's emotions still belonged to oneself. In the punishment bunkers of Auschwitz Block 11, there existed a variation even more extreme than the standing cells, the thirst bunker and the starvation bunker. While the starvation bunker, in which prisoners were locked away and given no food until they died, was horrific enough, producing deaths over a period of 1 to 3 weeks, the thirst bunker accelerated the process by denying all liquids. Death from dehydration is significantly faster and more agonizing than death from starvation. Within 2 to 3 days, victims experienced severe hallucinations, uncontrollable muscle spasms, cracking of the lips and tongue, swelling of the throat, and the sensation of their internal organs failing in sequence. Bruno Borgowiec, a Polish prisoner who served as an interpreter and assistant in the Block 11 bunker, later provided one of the few eyewitness accounts of life and death in these chambers. He described how prisoners in the starvation cells, driven mad by hunger, sometimes ate their own shoes, their clothing, or the straw of their mattresses. He described the sounds, the moaning that gave way to silence, cell by cell, over the course of days. It was in the starvation bunker of Block 11 that Father Maximilian Kolbe, a Polish Franciscan friar, spent his final days in August 1941. Kolbe had volunteered to take the place of a stranger, a Polish army sergeant named Franciszek Gajowniczek, who had been selected for death by starvation as part of a collective reprisal after a prisoner named Zygmunt Pilałowski escaped from the camp. The deputy commandant of Auschwitz, SS Hauptsturmführer Karl Fritsch, had ordered 10 men from Gajowniczek's block to die in the starvation bunker as punishment. When Gajowniczek, who had a wife and children, cried out in despair, Kolbe stepped forward and offered himself instead. According to Borgowiec's testimony, Kolbe spent the following 2 weeks leading the other condemned men in prayer and hymns, his calm demeanor so striking that even the SS guards were reportedly unnerved by it. One by one, the other 9 men died. Kolbe was the last alive, still conscious after more than 14 days without food or water. On August 14, 1941, the SS grew impatient. They needed the cell for a new batch of prisoners, and ordered the camp physician to administer a lethal injection of phenol directly into Kolbe's heart. Borgowiec, who was present, testified that Kolbe raised his left arm for the injection and looked his executioner in the eyes. He was 57 years old. Gajowniczek, the man whose place Kolbe took, survived Auschwitz, survived the death march to Berlin, was liberated by American forces, and lived until March 13, 1995, dying at the age of 93. He spent the remaining 5 decades of his life attending commemorations, speaking about Kolbe, and visiting the cell in Block 11 where the priest had died in his place. Kolbe was beatified by Pope Paul VI in 1971 and canonized by Pope John Paul II, himself a Pole who had lived through the occupation, in 1982, in a ceremony that Gajowniczek attended, weeping in the front row. In the camps operated by the Japanese military, particularly those connected to Unit 731 under the command of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii in occupied Manchuria, torture took forms that blurred the line between punishment, experimentation, and industrial-scale sadism. Unit 731 was officially designated as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, a deliberately innocuous name concealing a facility where at least 3,000 prisoners, mostly Chinese civilians, but also Koreans, Russians, Mongolians, and Allied prisoners of war, were subjected to experiments that included vivisection without anesthesia, deliberate infection with bubonic plague and cholera, amputation of limbs to study blood loss, and exposure to extreme pressure in decompression chambers. The prisoners were referred to internally as maruta, meaning logs, a term derived from the facility's cover story that it was a lumber mill. Among the less technologically elaborate methods practiced in the broader Japanese camp network was a practice in which prisoners were forced to stand motionless under the sun for hours, with a small pebble balanced on their head. If the pebble fell, from fatigue, from trembling, from a gust of wind, the prisoner was beaten and the ordeal restarted. It was a form of torture that required nothing but gravity and time, yet it achieved the same fundamental objective as the most elaborate apparatus, the total subjugation of a human being's body and will to the arbitrary power of another. What made the Unit 731 story particularly bitter in the post-war context was the fate of its perpetrators. Shiro Ishii and his senior researchers were granted immunity from prosecution by the United States government in exchange for exclusive access to their experimental data that had been extracted from the bodies of living human beings. Ishii died of throat cancer in 1959, a free man, in Tokyo. No member of Unit 731 was ever tried by an American or international court. As the historian Sheldon Harris noted in Factories of Death, the United States bought the data with the currency of impunity, and in doing so, became an accessory after the fact. If the physical tortures of the camps left visible scars, dislocated shoulders, broken spines, frostbitten limbs, the marks of the whip, the psychological tortures left damage that was in many ways deeper and more permanent, precisely because it was invisible, and because it followed survivors out of the camps and into the rest of their lives, sometimes for decades, sometimes until their final breath. The most systematic form of psychological torture masquerading as purpose was the medical experimentation program, which operated across multiple camps under the direction of SS physicians who held genuine medical degrees from Germany's most prestigious universities, men who had taken the Hippocratic Oath and then proceeded to violate it in every conceivable way. At Dachau, Dr. Sigmund Rascher, a Luftwaffe physician with close personal ties to Himmler, conducted high-altitude experiments in which prisoners were placed in low-pressure chambers that simulated altitudes of up to 20,000 meters. Rascher carefully documented the point at which his subjects' lungs ruptured, the moment when air bubbles appeared in their blood vessels, and the precise instant of their deaths, sometimes filming the process for later review. In his reports to Himmler, he described one subject's final moments with clinical detachment. After 4 minutes, the experimental subject began to perspire and wriggle his head. After 5 minutes, cramps occurred. Between 6 and 10 minutes, breathing increased in speed, and the subject became unconscious. The man was dead within minutes. Between 200 and 300 prisoners were subjected to these experiments. Approximately 80 died directly, and those who survived were often killed afterward to allow autopsy examination of their brains. At Auschwitz, Dr. Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death, a title that has entered common parlance as a synonym for medical evil, performed his notorious twin experiments, injecting dye into children's eyes to see if he could change their color, transfusing blood between twins of different blood types to observe the reaction, sewing twins together in a grotesque attempt to create conjoined siblings, and deliberately infecting one twin with a pathogen to see whether the other would spontaneously develop the same disease. Mengele was known to greet transports at the Birkenau ramp personally, scanning the lines of arriving prisoners with a conductor's eye, plucking twins from their families with a wave of his white-gloved hand and a cheerful "Zwillinge heraus," twins, step out. Eva Moses Kor, who with her twin sister Miriam was subjected to Mengele's experiments at the age of 10, later recalled, "We were treated like animals, worse than animals. At least animals in a laboratory are anesthetized." At Ravensbrück, the women's camp north of Berlin, Dr. Karl Gebhardt, Himmler's personal physician and president of the German Red Cross, inflicted deliberate wounds on the legs of female prisoners, mostly young Polish women whom the inmates called the Ravensbrück rabbits, and infected the wounds with bacteria, glass shards, and wood shavings to test the efficacy of sulfonamide drugs. 74 women were mutilated in these experiments. 5 died. At the Nuremberg doctors' trial in 1946–47, 23 physicians and scientists were prosecuted for their roles in the camp medical programs. 16 were found guilty. 7, including Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, were sentenced to death and hanged. Gebhardt was among them. Mengele, however, escaped to South America and lived under assumed identities in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil until his death by drowning in 1979. His body was not identified until 1985. These experiments produced almost no scientifically valid data. Their true function was not research, but the exercise of total power over human bodies redefined as raw material. Perhaps the cruelest psychological mechanism of all, however, was not any experiment or device, but the system of forced complicity, the deliberate strategy of making victims participate in their own destruction. The SS understood, with an almost scholarly insight into human psychology, that the most effective way to destroy a person was not to hurt them, but to make them hurt others, and then to let that knowledge consume them from within. The Sonderkommandos, special work units composed of prisoners, most of them Jewish, were forced to guide new arrivals into the gas chambers, sometimes reassuring them that they were going to a shower, to remove the bodies afterward, untangling limbs that had intertwined in the victim's final desperate scramble for air, to extract gold teeth from the mouths of the dead with pliers, to shave the hair from corpses for use in textile manufacturing, and to operate the crematoria, shoveling the remains of their own people into ovens that burned day and night. They lived in relative material comfort compared to other prisoners. Better food, better barracks, access to the possessions of the murdered. But this comfort was itself a weapon, a form of moral contamination designed to make them feel that they had purchased their survival with the deaths of their own community. Members of the Sonderkommando were themselves periodically killed and replaced, usually every few months, ensuring that no witnesses survived. Despite this, on October 7, 1944, the Sonderkommando at Crematorium 4 in Birkenau launched a desperate uprising using smuggled gunpowder, obtained in tiny quantities by women workers at the nearby Union munitions factory, including Esther Weichblum, Alla Gertner, Regina Safferstein, and Rosa Robota, to blow up the crematorium and attack the SS guards. The revolt was crushed within hours. 451 Sonderkommando members were killed. The 4 women who had smuggled the explosives were publicly hanged in January 1945, just weeks before the camp's liberation. Rosa Robota's last words, reportedly whispered to a fellow prisoner on the way to the gallows, were Hazak Vamatz, Hebrew for "be strong and brave." Some members of the Sonderkommando, knowing they were destined for death, buried written testimonies in the ground near the crematoria, in sealed jars and metal containers. These documents, discovered after the war and known as the Scrolls of Auschwitz, include the writings of Zalman Gradowski and Zalman Leuenthal, who described their daily existence in words that read like dispatches from the far side of human experience. Gradowski, who was killed during the October Revolt, had written, "Dear finder, search everywhere in every inch of soil. Dozens of documents are buried under it, mine and those of other persons, which will throw light on everything that was happening here. The few Sonderkommando members who survived the war, like the Greek-Italian chemist Shlomo Venezia, spent the rest of their lives carrying a burden that no therapeutic vocabulary was adequate to describe. Venezia, who published his testimony in 2007 under the title Inside the Gas Chambers, gave talks in schools for years, but could never speak without trembling. He described a particular form of suffering that no physical wound could match. You can heal a broken arm. You cannot heal having carried the body of a child to the ovens with your own hands. The camp system, in the end, was not merely a place where torture happened. It was a machine purpose-built to answer a question that no civilized society should ever have asked. What is the most efficient way to destroy a human being while keeping their body temporarily alive? The instruments described here: the hooks, the swings, the benches, the cells, the freezing water, the forced songs, the needles, the selections, the crematoria shovels placed into the hands of the victims themselves, were each individual components of that machine. Taken separately, each is an act of cruelty. Taken together, they constitute something larger and more terrifying: a system, refined through years of practice and bureaucratic iteration, for the industrial production of human suffering. Hannah Arendt, reporting on the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, coined a phrase that has since become one of the most debated concepts in modern thought: the banality of evil. What she meant was not that evil is trivial, but that the men who operated this system were, for the most part, terrifyingly ordinary. Not monsters, not demons, but bureaucrats, engineers, physicians, and soldiers who performed monstrous acts within a structure that made monstrousness routine. That ordinariness is perhaps the most disturbing legacy of all. As Primo Levi wrote in the final lines of The Drowned and the Saved, published in 1986, a year before his own death, "It happened, therefore it can happen again. This is the core of what we have to say.